What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining us at the Photographer's Lair. Today we are going to cover special effects with Photoshop brushes. There's tons of features built into the brush tool within Photoshop, and most people haven't really played with it until they get to know some of the tweaks and adjustments you can make to how the brush works. And it's a fantastic way to create some special effects in your images. So let's dive in. Okay, so for the first thing that we're going to demonstrate here is just a quick little sparkly like Firefly effect, or it can be sort of a soft particle effect or fairy dust, or however you want to use this, and it all depends on a few settings within the brush. So to show you really quick what it does, I've just got a regular small sized brush here. I'm just going to swoop across the image, and you can see pretty much right off the bat you got this really nice scattered soft glow effect. And this is just a normal layer. You can tweak with the layer settings and everything else and make that really stand out even more. So how did we set that up? In your brushes, I've actually got presets for this, but in here in your brush settings, okay, like I said, we just started with a regular paintbrush, 0% on the hardness. You can make it whatever size you want to initially, but down here in this little window you get kind of a preview of the effect. So in the brush tip shape, you want to take this spacing all the way up, and you can see that scatters everything out. Now I've got all these other effects on, and that's kind of what gives it that scattering effect. So in the shape dynamics is where you can set your minimum diameter, so it won't go below a certain size. I've got that set at about 7%. Angle jitter doesn't really matter with a specifically round brush like this, but if you had something that was like a linear whatever, the angle jitter would rotate it around as you paint across your image. Roundness jitter, I'll show you that in the main setting here. This defines the roundness. You can, take this and squish it down into a flat little thing as well. So as you would paint, you would get a more flattened kind of look like that. But I want to keep it as round for this effect. Let's go back to the shape dynamics. Minimum roundness again does the same kind of thing. So scattering, this one is what gives you the spread back and forth as you paint. Okay. Opacity, probably somewhere in there, maybe even a little bit less. So we'll go about 8%. So they don't go full transparent, but there are some that are softer and some that are brighter. Okay, so as you paint with this, you get that nice scattering effect. Now you can also run the count up and count jitter. That just impacts how much is coming out of the brush with each stroke. So this will give you little clusters. So over here there wasn't as much, and over here it built up more. So the different effects you can do with this are pretty cool. So we'll run the count back down to 2, and you can just come through here and swipe like that. You can just kind of play with that and tweak it to your taste as you brush along while you're doing this. And your starting size on your paintbrush will also affect that. So if you start with a larger size paintbrush, you get these larger blobs, which for this look doesn't really work as much. But depending on what you're working on, you might like that starting point. So just something like that to create some nice little soft glows. Now you can also pick like a light yellow color if you want a warmer look to it. And one of the things that I like to do with this effect, I just painted on my background layer, which I don't want to do. Let's create a new layer to put that effect on. Redo it kind of like that. So I will hit Control J to duplicate that layer, and then go up here to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian blur that, something like that, and then we'll set that to a linear dodge and uncheck that checkbox, and you get this little bright glow. For fireflies, that might not be the right effect, but you can play around with that blur amount and other things and just see if you like Yeah, if we really blur it out, it softens it out and makes it kind of a more punchy look overall. Maybe bring the opacity of that down a little. Just different things you can do to create these little ethereal, sparkly glow things, right? Okay, so we're going to close out of that. Don't want to save that. Next, I want to show you how to create a signature brush. So literally, you can use a paintbrush to sign your images, which is really pretty cool. Some of us, you know, we may have a studio logo or whatever, but for a fine art image or something like that, you might want to actually sign your name to it. So if you just create a new document, so you can go to File, New, or hit Control Command N on a Mac. Come on, man, I'm having issues. And let's just go with 2000 by 2000. You can crop it down after you're done, and just make that so you've got this square document. So with a brush preset that we're going to create, it has to be a black and white image, basically. And you can come up here and set that mode. To grayscale, and you're going to want a harder brush for this, somewhere around in mid, 40 to 50% ish range, and you really should use a pen tablet, drawing tablet, to do this. Trying to sign your name with a mouse is virtually impossible to do. So if you don't have one, highly recommend getting one. But you just come in here and make sure you reset your brush. Don't try to sign with a Firefly Effect brush. That doesn't work. All right, come on, David, get this together. We're gonna come up here to soft mechanical brush. Undo that. Bring that back up a little bit hard, and for what I want, I think about 15, so that's still too much. Size that down to 7. Alright, so you may or may not like your first attempt at signing your name with a tablet. That's maybe not exactly what I would do, but for demonstration, I'm just going to go with it. So really simply, I've got that. I'm going to now just crop that so that I don't have a whole lot of wasted extra. Clear that. So like so. All right. So once you have that done, all you need to do is go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and that will, you can call it a sampled brush or whatever. I'm just going to call it DVD Signature. All right, so now that is a paintbrush that you can put on any image that you have. So if I come over here, switch this to white, I can just click, and there's my name. I've got a layer style effect on this that I'm going to show you for a different effect, but there you have your signature, and you can obviously size that up and down just like any other paintbrush. Okay, and then obviously, just so you know, in your brush palette, that then gets dropped in here at the bottom of your brushes. And you can move that around and put it in groups and everything else. And you can see here I'm actually working on a series of brushes for the Photographer's Lair group that will be available at some time later this summer, hopefully, depending on how crazy this world gets. There's a signature brush. What else do we want to do? Let's create a particle effect brush. Now, to do that, lots of possible ways of doing it. If you find a example image that you want to play with, you can use that to start with. But I'm going to go File, New, and just use the same 2000 by 2000 pixels that we did on the last one. Okay, that bothers me, so I'm going to go back to a regular hard mechanical brush. Really for this, I'm just going to create a new layer and use the lasso tool and just feather it by 1 pixel. I don't want a super solid hard edge on this, but you want to actually just draw little particles, and the more you put into this, the more detailed it will be. So, you know, play with that and you'll get a feel for what works for you in the style of images you want to do. But you just want to create these, and you have to hold the shift key while you do this, so it'll create multiple selections. But make some larger, different directions, some little small bits, and the more jaggedy and whatever you make your selections, the obviously the more jagged looking your particles will be. So depends on the kind of particle you want to create on what kinds of shapes you want to do with this. If you want something that looks more like an ink splatter effect, you want to make more smooth, curvy selections. Okay. So I'll just go through here and make some of these, and then we'll catch up to it at the end. So now that you've got your selection made, what you want to do is just come in here with black as your main color, hold down the Alt or Option key and hit your Delete key, and that just fills that selection with black. You can also go up to Edit, Fill, and use foreground color, however you want to fill that with black. You can even just use a paintbrush and paint with black when that selection is active. So either way, now you've got this little spattering of elements, and if you want to, you know, enhance this and go further with it, you can actually just like duplicate that layer and transform it, maybe rotate it around so that you get more of these clustered in different areas. Maybe flip it so that it doesn't look exactly like the same things. Okay, so you've got different ways of adding more to this as you see fit. I'll leave it at that. Maybe have a little more dense in the center, like so. All right. Now, same thing. Once you have that done, you just want to go to Edit, Define, Brush Preset, and I'm going to call this PL Particles 1. Okay. So now we have a particle brush. So what do you do with that? For instance, a motorsport image. Now this isn't mine. I just went to Pixabay and pulled it off of there. But you know, he's got a little bit of dirt down here that's flying out from there, but I want to enhance it, make it a little bit more. So I'm going to use this paintbrush, hold down the Alt key to pick a brown color, and just come in here. And one of the things you want to experiment to is the same things that we did with the Firefly, so the scattering and everything else, because if you just paint like that, you get this weird smeary look that doesn't really look that great. So I'm going to go back to the brush presets. Okay, so you come back up into your brush settings, and again, if you don't have this stuff over here on the side where these brush settings are, that's all just in your window brush settings. You can use the shortcut key that's listed here, F5. So however you want to get to that is fine. Just that's what you're looking for, is this icon. We want to go back to brush tip shape, push the spacing out, right, and play with that. Shape dynamics, again, looking at the preview down here, you know, you can get the size, jitter, minimum diameter, bring that up, angle jitter so it rotates around a little bit, roundness, I'll leave that as round. Scattering, we want to scatter it out a little bit, playing with the count and jitter. Let's see, transfer, texture, flow. You can see how that kind of lowers or intensifies the density of that. So I don't think I need to mess with the opacity. Let's see what that does. That's pretty decent. So we'll go with that and just come in here, and that's a little bit dark so it doesn't get noticed as much, but you come in, kind of just swipe across there with a few different colors of brown. And, you know, okay, so that looks ish, not the best, but maybe come in and get a little bit coming off the front like so. And you can mask these things off and whatever so that it looks a little nicer. Go back to my regular soft paintbrush, painting with black on the layer mask, which you create with this icon down here, so that, you know, some of these maybe not all scattering out as much as I want. And then we can go back and, for instance, add a little bit of motion blur to that, so you play with the angle of it, so it actually, that's a little extreme. I don't need a distance that far, probably just 14, 10, 11-ish or so. Make it look like it's coming off of the tire a little bit more. So, real quick example of how you could use a particle brush in something like this. Now, obviously, I'd spend a little more time adding some more detail and making it look a little better as far as coming off the tire, but you can get the idea of how this might work. And those particle brushes can be used in a lot of different ways. Obviously, explosions and those kinds of effects are great. Like I said, if you make more rounded selections, it looks more like a paint splatter, and you can just play with how those look and make them fit the kind of image that you're working on. Okay. Not going to save that. It's up to you whether you save your brush preset file. So I'll show you one here shortly for the image I created with Brittany, where there was fire and ice. I created my own ice texture. So let's just go ahead and look at that. No, I don't need to save that. That's my signature. I don't need to save that. But this was the ice texture I created. Now, you can see there's a bunch of layers built into this. And what I started with was just this, which was a color ice image off of Pixabay again, but I didn't like, you know, it's going to come off with these hard edges in the final brush. So I started adding duplicates in and inverting them and masking them so that it eventually softened those edges up and had this darker black center. So when I paint with this, the center is going to apply more of that paint, and then the edges kind of fade off and soften, right? So this was the final image for the fire and ice project a while back, and I think I've got something invisible here, but that's all right. But if you come all the way down to here, there's a blue, and then there's some fog, and then there's these two, which are ice layers. So this is where I used that paintbrush, which looks like this. Okay, so if I just switch default and paint on here, I've got this little smudgy ice, right? Now I've added in some drop shadow and different coloring edges to this, so there's a little bit of a blue in the drop shadow to give it more of a three-dimensional look when I paint with that. So again, what I was doing when I was painting in on this layer here, so for example, if I just create a new layer, and I'm going to bring that layer effect up here. So if you hold down the Alt key or Option on a Mac and click on the effect and drag it up to this other layer, it copies those effects. So if I just come over here and go to my brush presets, rotate that around, and just click once, you can see it's got a little bit of a blue edge to it, and that's how I created this sort of icy, smeary effect on her arms, with the blue, dark blue undertones, and then painting on it with this brush that's got a little bit of a drop shadow to it. Okay, what I want to show you with another version from another image from this same shoot is if we take, for instance, that particle brush that we just created. Okay, for instance, if I just paint right there, you have this, okay, that looks like shattered white whatever on top of that sphere. But let's say we want to make it look like it's glowing with this blue light. Okay, first thing that I would do would be to just use the soft paintbrush and come in here and maybe at about 10% just create a little bit of a glow, and then size down and solidify that more in the center, so we kind of create that halo effect. You can play with the linear dodge blend mode on that, and again, I like turning off that transparency shapes layer effect so that it creates that bright glow. That's maybe a little too intense, so bring down the opacity of it until you get sort of the look that you want. But the next thing I'm going to do is create a new layer. We're going to go to that particle brush. Okay, but now I want to come in here and squish it flat so that it looks a little more linear, and bring the opacity up. So if I do that, that's what you're going to get. But we want to also play with the angle jitter and size as well. So if I come in here and just click, maybe bring that angle jitter all the way up because I want it to rotate around. Maybe a little more intense than I would normally want to do, but you can quickly see we're getting this little bit of a spark effect. Okay, and you can, you know, intensify that, come up to filter, blur, radial, try to pick your center point so it matches the center of the image, which is always nice, and go there. So that effect is now looking like those particles are zooming out from that sphere a little bit. And if you Control Alt F does that same filter again, maybe intensify that a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to do the same things that I did before on the ice effect and add a little bit of a glow and drop shadow effect to this to create some really unique effect. So you can either double click in the gray area of the layer or come up here to layer style, and we're just going to go with drop shadow to start with. Normally a drop shadow is for creating a drop shadow, obviously, but I want to kind of twist that around and make it do something else that it's not really designed to do. So what we're looking to do is create a glowy, sparkly effect out of this, which means we're going to go with an outer glow. I'm going to change that color to that soft blue light color, and you may want to play with the, you know, the blend mode on that. Some image, sometimes a hard light looks good, sometimes linear dodge looks good. That's a little too bright for this instance. For this one I'm going to go with soft light. And you know, you can just move these sliders around. The spread doesn't necessarily look good. If I bring that up, the size effect will just kind of soften that up and range. So you just want a little bit of an external glow to that effect. In the drop shadow, what we're going to do is come back to that same blue color. Now, this is the only time I've ever used this blend mode, But if you come in here to dissolve, you know, bring the size up a little bit, what you can start to see is you get these little soft particles. Okay, and obviously you don't want to go too far with some of this stuff, and play with how that looks in your images. The distance basically moves, you know, where those particles show up in your image. For this effect, I want it to be 0, so it's right there around each of those particles, each of those little streaks of light. So it just gives it a little extra sparkly effect. Okay. Now again, you can do different things with this. You can duplicate that layer and scale it up or blur it out and create different aspects to that. And I think for this one, I'm going to go ahead and run that Radial Blur filter again and leave it at that. Now, what else can you do with this kind of look? If you wanted to have sort of a foggy effect with that same sparkly ethereal thing going on, if I create a new layer, and I'm going to use the same effects that we just created, so Alt, drag it up there. I'm going to come over here to the Smudge brush. The brush that you use for this doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot, but you want to make sure your strength on this Smudge brush is set to 99%. It's just one of those quirky things about Photoshop on how this works, but the same thing, I've got that flattened brush that I kind of have different the rotation set to it, and then you can come in here and smudge this around. Now, depending on your computer system, it might be a little slow in processing that, which is fine, but the more you smudge it around, you can see the main particle or main effect that you lay down, the pixels that you lay down initially get smeared out and softened up. So if you just tap once, it lays down the white streaks of that particle brush. Then you hold down the Alt key or Option and it will smudge it around. Same thing, you don't have to hold down the Alt key. If you just click and then smudge around, it will smudge things. So practice with that, because it takes a little bit of work to get used to, but you can just hit different areas and kind of create this thing, and then hold down the Alt key, Option on a Mac, and drag through there. And you can see my system's kind of working at processing this stuff. That's fine. But you can use that to create this sort of ethereal, glowy mist with those particles. You can come in and, you know, adjust how much of that is showing up in that layer by adjusting your opacity and the size and all those different sliders for this effect. And then, so that has those extra little particles. If we duplicate this layer and rasterize it, the thing about the rasterizing is it kind of gets rid of the actual little particles, but you still have the swoopy, so it's a different look, but it's kind of cool. Come in and blur that out a little more, and again set it to like a linear dodge and turn that on. So, you know, you can play with these things and get this magical lighting swooping around in your image and create really kind of cool effects. Those are some of the kinds of things that you can do with it, and like I said, there's a lot of other things built into each of these brush shapes, the brush settings dialog. So get in there and play with those and create some brushes that work in a unique way and see what you can come up with.